Ukraine struck Vladimir Putin's secret palace in Crimea. For the first time, the war has touched Crimea, the Kremlin's showcase, so deeply. Panic is spreading. Fear is rising in waves. Because this time, the target is not ordinary people, but the faces at the top of the regime. The Russian elite have always watched this war from afar. Others died in the trenches. Others suffered, were mobilized, and were buried in frozen ground. While ordinary citizens struggled with the burning pain of war, the Kremlin elite lived peacefully in Crimea, Putin's bulletproof paradise. But they were wrong. On September 21st, during a secret event held at the Foros Sanatorium at the southernmost tip of Crimea, this illusion was shattered. Kiev had planned this attack weeks in advance. However, the target was not an ordinary military facility. Although ostensibly a health and recreation facility, the sanatorium was a closed-off, high-security area, frequently hosting elite bureaucrats close to the Kremlin and individuals with FSB connections. Ukrainian intelligence determined that high-level figures would attend the event to be held there. The target was confirmed using satellite imagery, signal intelligence, and information from partisan networks. The operation was carried out with a high degree of secrecy and with the direct approval of the command echelon. The attack began at around 7:30 p.m. local time. Numerous kamikaze-type unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, approaching the area locked onto the target at low altitude. Some of the UAVs slipped through radar blind spots and reached the sanatorium compound. The first explosion occurred at the rear of the protocol building, where guests were being hosted. The shockwave from the explosion shattered windows and destroyed some walls. This was followed by a second and third wave. According to initial reports from the scene, at least 3 people were killed and 16 were injured. Several of the injured are in critical condition. It is alleged that guests linked to the FSB and some federal-level bureaucrats were in the area at the time of the explosion. However, this information has not been confirmed by Russian authorities. The wreckage of a drone, which is alleged to have been shot down, fell on a grassy area in the Yalta region and caused a brief fire. The fire was brought under control. However, this detail reveals that the drones crossed both the coastal defense and the inner line. Russian officials repeated the classic rhetoric about the attack. Ukraine carried out a terrorist attack on a civilian facility. However, the site's organic connection to the FSB, the structure of the target, and the identity of the people present at the time of the attack undermined these explanations. To understand why this attack was much more than a routine military operation, one must know Foros's place in the collective memory of the Russian state. Foros is not just any vacation resort. Since the Soviet era, it has been a refuge where Politburo members, KGB chiefs, generals, and top party officials, the nomenklatura, lived in luxury, isolated from the world in a way ordinary Soviet citizens could not even imagine. 4 enormous state summer palaces, operated by the state, surrounded by high walls and guards, along with the sanatorium serving them, made this place akin to a Soviet Camp David. Being here was proof that you were in the innermost circle of the regime. However, Foros's real fame stems from witnessing the collapse of an empire. In August 1991, communist conservatives who attempted a coup to save the Soviet Union placed the last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was vacationing at his dacha in Crimea at the time, under house arrest right here in Foros. The fate of the world was locked in for several days, awaiting news from this isolated resort town. The coup failed, but when Gorbachev returned to Moscow, he was no longer at the height of his power, and a few months later, the Soviet Union was history. Since that day, Foros has been not only a luxury retreat, but also a historical site, symbolizing the loss of central authority, the collapse of an empire, and the fragility of the illusion of control. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, Putin also inherited this historical legacy. The state dachas and sanatoriums in Foros were now at the service of the new Russian elite. Oligarchs, ministers, and most importantly, FSB generals who had grown rich thanks to their loyalty to Putin. It is no coincidence that the Foros Sanatorium, which was attacked, was directly linked to the Russian Internal Intelligence Service, the FSB. It had become a power center where the new regime's rituals of loyalty were performed, secret deals were made, and rewards were distributed. However, this picture is being reversed. The Foros attack destroyed the carefully constructed image of Crimea as an elite refuge overnight. This was not just an explosion, but also the collapse of the economic and psychological significance that Putin's regime had attached to Crimea since its annexation in 2014. The Kremlin had designed Crimea not only for military superiority, but also as a showcase region, where the new Russian elite could breathe easily and the wealthy class, shunned by the West, could express itself. Upper-class investors from Moscow and St. Petersburg, forced to abandon the Mediterranean coast due to sanctions, were directed to Crimea as an alternative. The state offered credit facilities, tax incentives, and infrastructure promises to make real estate investments attractive. Thus, the peninsula's most valuable coastal strips began to fill with private yacht marinas, spa hotels, luxury villas, and summer complexes reserved for government officials. Areas like Foros, Alupka, and Yalta became symbols of prestige, both politically and economically. Crimea became the coastal strip of Putin's new Russian dream. However, the attack on September 21st turned this dream into a nightmare. The drone attack on the Foros Sanatorium meant not only physical damage, but also a direct blow to investor psychology. Properties in Crimea are no longer seen as symbols of luxury and privilege. They are now viewed as high-risk assets that could be hit by a kamikaze drone at any moment. After the attack, the number of listings from Crimea on major Russian real estate portals skyrocketed. However, while many wanted to sell, almost no one wanted to buy. Property owners were trying to offload the luxury homes they had invested millions of rubles in, but they were met with silence. Unsold villas were now not only an economic burden, but also a measure of confidence in the regime. Because these properties were not only losing value, they could also become completely toxic, along with deeds that could be deemed legally invalid by Ukraine in the future. However, this collapse was not new, only accelerated. In the first 2 years after 2014, there was high demand for housing in Crimea from within Russia. Housing prices rose by 25 to 30%. Bureaucrats and retirees were directed to the region with incentives offered by the state. However, international isolation led to the complete withdrawal of foreign investment. Starting in 2016, the real estate market stalled and then slowly began to decline. Although official data suggests that prices remained stable in rubles, foreign currency values rapidly eroded. The disappointment in tourism was even deeper. The promise that Crimea will be an alternative to the Turkish Riviera did not materialize due to insufficient flight connections, lack of infrastructure, and geopolitical risks. The absence of foreign tourists kept domestic demand limited. The war that began in 2022 and the subsequent attack on the Saki airbase and the Kerch bridge explosion cemented the perception that Crimea was no longer a safe place. By the end of 2022, listings for homes for sale in Crimea on Russian real estate sites had increased by 40 to 50%, while sales volume continued to decline. Throughout 2023 and 2024, this trend became even more pronounced. A depreciation of up to 20% in ruble terms was reported. However, this was an average figure. In some areas, the actual decline was much greater. Buyers were concerned about the future of properties in Crimea. What will happen to these deeds if Ukraine wins? If the region becomes a conflict zone again, who will return here? The Foros attack added a new dimension to these questions. Now it was no longer just about investment, but about personal safety. After the attack, it wasn't just money that was being discussed. The elite felt that their own lives were being targeted. This situation triggered a wave of reverse migration that began in 2022, but peaked with the latest attacks. As is well known, after the 2014 annexation, Russia began encouraging tens of thousands of Russian citizens to settle on the peninsula. The aim was to turn Crimea into Russian territory and shift the demographic structure in its favor. According to Russia's official 2014 Crimean census results, the total population of the peninsula was reported to be 2.28 million. This census reflected that Russians made up 67.9% of the population, Ukrainians 15.7%, and Crimean Tatars 10.6%. The ethnic Russian population has reached 1.5 million, thanks to migration and military personnel families since 2014. However, with the war in Ukraine, the situation has changed, especially for Russian officers and their families. The families of Russian military personnel stationed in Crimea are concerned that Crimea could be a target in the counter-offensive against Ukraine. The Ukrainian partisan movement Atesh made important assessments on this issue. Atesh reported that almost all of the families of senior personnel of the Black Sea Fleet had left the peninsula. The movement attributes this to an internal directive ordering Russian forces to take higher security measures at military facilities in Crimea. According to a report by Germany's Deutsche Welle, based on diplomatic sources, Moscow has launched a priority quota system for the families of security personnel stationed in Crimea. The initial target was to relocate around 10,000 people to Krasnodar and Stavropol. The partisan network reported that Bar's reserve units were conducting secret patrols in civilian clothing in the bays of Sevastopol, that security measures had been increased, and that equipment was being hidden. In addition, all leave days for the military have been cancelled. According to a statement by an Atesh agent directly involved with air defense systems, air defense personnel have begun evacuating their families to military camps in the southern military district. This evacuation order can be seen as a sign that the security situation in the region is critical. It is alleged that the Russian administration plans to evacuate approximately 250,000 people in the first phase, including military families, defense industry technicians, railway and port operating personnel, children, and the elderly. According to an analysis published by Forbes Russia at the end of April, the Black Sea Fleet headquarters has 30,000 family members, half of whom have already left between May and July 2025. In addition to military personnel, ordinary Russians on the peninsula are also leaving Crimea. Reports indicate that the number of Russian citizens who have recently left the peninsula has reached 100,000. Symbolic attacks such as Foros will further accelerate this exodus. This is proof that Putin's Russification project in Crimea has effectively failed. For the elites who cannot or do not want to stay, Crimea is no longer a paradise but a gilded cage. Increased security measures, checkpoints set up on every corner, soldiers patrolling constantly, and the lights of air defense systems illuminating the night are turning those luxury villas into prisons. The feeling of freedom and immunity is giving way to a constant sense of paranoia and entrapment. War is no longer an abstract operation in a distant geography, watched on TV screens for the Russian elite. It is no longer losses expressed in numbers on television news bulletins. It has become a threat that reaches their bedrooms, summer gardens, and the verandas where their children play. The explosions in Foros shattered not only a resort, but also the privileged armor of immunity of this class. This change represents a profound rupture for the Kremlin. For Vladimir Putin's power rests not primarily on military might, but on the loyalty and shared interests of the elite class loyal to him. Oligarchs, the security bureaucracy, media moguls, defense industry executives, and federal district representatives. All of these names are the most important pillars of the system. Their peace and security are a prerequisite for the stability of the regime. But now this balance is being shaken. As the illusion that the war is being fought far away crumbles, a new psychological climate is emerging among the upper classes. Questions such as, how long will this war last? If our home is targeted tomorrow, who will protect us? If we are winning, why are we now suffering? Were once only whispered, but are now being openly voiced in closed meetings. No one is directly confronting Putin yet. However, this unease has the potential to undermine a regime that is sustained more by endurance than by support. This is because the political elite in Russia's support for Putin was less an ideological allegiance than a status quo agreement that secured their interests. If this war begins to threaten those areas of interest, then that support will begin to crumble. As a result, Ukraine has shifted its war strategy in Crimea from a mere war of attrition to a sophisticated psychological war. The goal is no longer just to weaken the Russian army, but also to undermine the system's stability from within by directly targeting the symbols of power on which the regime relies and the personal security of the Russian elite. The party is over for the elite, and the end of this party may be the first sign of how the party will end for all of Russia. If you want to see behind the curtain of reality with such deep analysis, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. This channel grows with you. Every subscriber, every comment, every like is a step toward bringing these truths to more people. See you in the next video. Take care, and thank you for choosing us.